Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a great day. I'd like to talk about something that I haven't talked about on the channel for quite some time, and that is Dungeons and Dragons, D&D. There's always some kind of controversy going on with D&D, whether it is some part of the fan base being disliked by Wizards of the Coast, the company that owns the property at this point, or it is, some strange rule change. I don't pay a ton of attention to that stuff anymore because it's just kind of noise at this point. But I did want to talk about a few things that I think have been circulating in the rumor mill and causing a lot of controversy in my circles, at least. Three things. Number one is one D&D, the possibility of that being a subscription for the next edition of D&D rather than calling it 6th edition. It'll be one edition, D&D 1, where they can constantly revise the rules going forward, and it'll be all digitally integrated. The second one is the possibility of AI Dungeon Masters or AI Game Masters, either as a part of this one D&D subscription or just as an idea in general that I'd like to address. And the last one is the open game license and the end of the open game license, which is a complicated thing, but just basically allowed people to use D&D rules for other things. So let me go through it. Let me start with actually the possibility of AI Dungeon Master. So someone asked me in another video, hey, would you play with an AI DM? Or maybe they asked me on a live stream. I'm like, hell yeah, I'd play with an AI DM. Why not? Because to me, that's like the role that most people don't really want to do. They want to play the game. They don't want to be looking through monster manuals and executing rules and things like that. But what I realized thinking about it, why are people not liking the idea of an AI DM? This is a very whoa, we don't want AI dungeon masters. The first one is that most people don't follow the rules. So that's point number one. Most people, when they play D&D, this really goes back all the way to first edition. They don't play the rules, so they're not really playing Dungeons and Dragons. An AI DM presumably would follow the rules, which would take a lot of the fun out of the game from that perspective. I think most people view D&D as really a starter for adult pretend play and for people to, execute their creative ideas. They don't really want something that's just going to execute the rules and pull up monsters from the monster manual and follow the rules of the Dungeon Master's guide and stuff like that. So that's point number one. Point number two, most DMs should be writing books, not running games. So this is a thing. They view the Dungeon Master experience as a creative endeavor where they're crafting a world and having people do things in it. And sometimes players view Dungeons and Dragons as some sort of collaborative storytelling thing, and that's not what I view it as. I view it as a game. That is, it's focused around gameplay, not story. Story is an emergent factor. It's about your story. It's about the story that happens because the rules are being executed, the random encounters are happening. It's like, oh, do you remember that time your character dropped the thunderstone and went deaf and didn't hear the orc stab in the back, whatever it was, because those rules created that situation, not because it was scripted by a writer. So a lot of DMs should consider learning how to write a book, and a lot of authors honestly should consider making an RPG because they don't really want to write plot. They want to do world building. The problem with writing an RPG, I guess I'll get to, which is really that most people think of RPGs as D&D. They're not really interested in buying or playing new RPGs. Anyway, point number three, we already have AI DMs. They're in video games. Most people don't view video games as the same as tabletop RPGs, and they don't want to play video games because they don't want to follow the rules. So it goes back to point number one. Video games are not viewed as an AI DM experience, even if you play something like Neverwinter Nights, or a similar rule set like the Star Wars RPGs like KOTOR. They don't view that as a D&D experience because it's following the rules. There's a set of rules. And then I already mentioned this, but point number four really is that most people think of D&D as a shorthand for RPG. They don't really consider playing a different game, even if they don't like the rules. They just make up their own rules, and an AI DM would probably go away with that. And if you wanted to play a different game, if you wanted to even play Pathfinder, which is very popular, it's harder to find people to play Pathfinder than to play, hey, do you want to come over and play Dungeons and Dragons? People understand what Dungeons and Dragons is. They're like, hey, you want to come over and play Pathfinder? Like, huh? Or Vampire the Masquerade or some other RPG. So people really just use D&D as a shorthand for RPG, and then it's just a starting point for some pretend play with kind of rules bounding it in. And yes, kids play with rules when they do pretend play as well. If you've never had kids or watched them play, maybe you don't realize that, but that's what they do. So let's switch over to 1D&D. So 1D&D is a bad idea, but not for the reasons that most people are talking about. Most people are talking about it purely from their perspective as people who are fans of D&D. They're not really thinking about why it maybe is a misstep for the company other than it's them doing something they don't like. So I think one of the things that's really common with most companies, especially nowadays, is they want to convert sales into rents. That is, we want to charge you a subscription for 1D&D because we want you to rent Dungeons and Dragons. We don't want you to buy a book and own it forever. The people who bought Dungeons and Dragons books in 1980 or whenever they bought them still have the same game that they bought back then. How does Wizards of the Coast or whichever company TSR happens to own the game at that point going to sell you more copies? Well, they invented this thing called editions so that they could try to convert it somewhat into a rent. Like, you got to play the new edition of D&D. We've revised the rules. So that's a natural impulse. The problem is, really, this is my first point. Point number one for 1D&D is that D&D is no longer about games. It's a lifestyle brand. Lifestyle brands you don't rent out. Rather, you license them for merchandising and things like that. You don't try to just charge someone rent to involve themselves with a lifestyle brand. Rather, like, you sell them shirts and things like that, or you license it for a movie to play on the strength of your trademark and things like that. That's what lifestyle brands do. My second point is that most fans actually don't play the games. This kind of goes back to, like, they don't play the rules, but I think a lot of fans don't play the games. They just are into the merchandising stuff. They're into Neverwinter Nights, and really, I include myself in this. I don't play tabletop RPGs anymore. My lifestyle doesn't really allow it. I used to do it more with, like, OpenRPG and online tools because it's hard to get people in a physical space, but now I mostly just don't play them. I have a memory of playing them. So I include myself in this. Most people don't play the games. They buy the books, they put the books on the shelf, maybe they get some nerd cred for having them, and when they do play, they just play by house rules or they ignore rules. They're not going to rent something they're not using. That's the big point. So they're not going to pay for a 1D&D subscription when they already don't play the books that they bought. Rather, they like buying the books as part of their collection of D&D, because they like to just collect things and have them, and they like to look through the books and look at the cool art and, like, have a cool RPG book, but they don't really play the games very often. Well, if you're only playing the games every so often or dropping into someone else's session, you're not going to pay for a 1D&D subscription. You're not playing. Most people who are into the brand are not playing D&D the way that people play World of Warcraft. That's the big point that I want to get across. Now, you could possibly convert them if you reduce the friction to playing enough. And I think that's one of the points with 1D&D and trying to look at online tools to facilitate play, like AI Dungeon Masters or things like that, is to significantly reduce the friction for customers to actually get into your game and play it. I actually think that is not a bad strategy. But I do think that it's unrealistic to assume people are going to pay a subscription for something they barely interact with. They like to buy it as a lifestyle brand, collect the books, read the books, maybe read some novels here and there. And like I said, I do include myself in that. I used to read, the Forgotten Realms novels and stuff like that, more than I would end up playing the games. That's just the way life shakes out in the modern times. Point number 3 is really the open game license. It had to go. It had to go so that everyone's on the same page, that everyone's buying into your same rules, so that you can sell 1D&D, which is supposedly compatible with all these other back supplements. So you're trying to bring everything into one big pile to sell that idea of 1D&D. It's no more additions, just constant, variations of rules revisions going forward. You just keep buying in, month after month to the D&D idea. And in order to get people to do that, you really have to get rid of OGL. There is, however, some legal stuff where you may not be able to, like, copyright the rule sets at all, right? They may not be. D&D is a trademark, but rolling a 20-sided die is not a trademark. That's not something you can really copyright. Like, you can't patent gameplay ideas in that way. You could certainly copyright the images you use. You could copyright the words that are in the books. You can copyright the way the rules are written, but the idea of the gameplay is not something that you can manageably copyright. At least that's my understanding of it. So really the big idea here, and this is the last big idea, is that Wizards of the Coast is a game company that's pretending to make D&D. This is something that a lot of people, they just don't even consider it. Gary Gygax has been dead for a while. He lost control of the D&D property for many years before he died. Virtually every person who was involved, in fact, every person who was involved in the original version of D&D is no longer involved with D&D. So Wizards of the Coast is a bunch of people that, due to the legal nature of like owning a trademark, are able to publish things that say Dungeons and Dragons on them. That doesn't make them Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is something specific. It's a game that was made specifically once upon a time. And future editions of it, even though I've played those, I've played 3rd edition, played 2nd edition, played 4th edition, and even some 5th edition. These are different games. 5th edition D&D is just a different RPG, but it's the weight of that lifestyle brand. It's the weight of the D&D brand that is behind that. It's really just kind of a pretension. Like, you wouldn't buy tickets to a Metallica concert for a bunch of people that weren't in Metallica in 1983, right? There's 2 original members of Metallica, Lars Ulrich and James Hetfield, that have always been in the band. And maybe you could lose one of those, and like, it's just James. But if there's no James and no Lars, it's not Metallica. But we don't, for whatever reason, we don't tend to think that way when it's a corporate product. Most people don't. I think that way. So it's like, we should reject corporate products that have no authorship legacy. And it's not just like a Ship of Theseus kind of thing, but it's really that the property's been bought and sold several times, and it's just now carried out by people who have no relation to the original creators at all. So really, it's a corporate fiction that is modern D&D. And with that in mind, the question is, like, are they making a good product that you want to buy? If they are, then I guess, you can go for it. And if you don't like it, well, the books will always be there. You can always go and buy the books. My big point about people don't by the rules, all of these absurd rule changes that they've been trying to make for years now don't really matter, because people don't play by the rules anyway. They just do whatever they want at their own table. If you really wanted to play by the rules, you'd go play like 1st edition and see how that works out, and then maybe make your own game. And I don't see any way that you could stop people from continuing to make their own games in the vein of D&D. Unfortunately, this is my big, I guess, wrap-up point, is that D&D is such a big lifestyle brand. It's such a behemoth of the idea of RPGs that even if they completely mess up this and it's not a big success, I think they can make it work, simply because it's the biggest brand. It's the brand in tabletop RPGs, and I think a lot of people will just go along with it. I think the people who actually play D&D are going to end up using one D&D. I don't think that they're going to check out and just continue to use their old books forever. In fact, it's pretty rare that I meet anyone that played like back in the 80s that still uses the old books. It's more like they're going back to them after playing many other games. It's one game among many that they play, rather than, it's the game they play. But for people that are like, we have a D&D game that we play weekly with our friends, they're gonna keep on the bandwagon for that, and the rent conversion will be at least somewhat successful in that way. But I think the bigger point is that, like, renting out the lifestyle brand, you're actually going to lose some proportion of sales to people who just like to buy the books and only occasionally play. They're not going to pay a subscription for it. It's like, would you pay a subscription to World of Warcraft if you only bother to turn on your computer once or twice a month? You probably wouldn't, right? Unless you just didn't care about money at all. So I guess that's my big points there. I have no problem with AI DMs, but you leave me your thoughts down below about what you think about all of this stuff, Dungeon Masters and AI Dungeon Masters, and what you think about all of those. I'd love to see other people's opinions. I'm not saying that you have to. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody in this video either. Like, the fact that people use D&D as a starter to do their own role play, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's your table. You can play whatever game you want to play. But I think a lot of people assume, maybe the game designers assume people are playing by the rules more than they really are. I don't know. Anyway, leave me your thoughts down below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, I am a writer. I'm not a DM guy who should be a writer. I'm a writer. I'm a writer of books, and so you can check those out. Newest one is called, newest ones. I have them right here. Let's get them out. There goes a toy. Afterglow, Generation Y, and All Shall Fall, though. So these are the newest one. This is Tragic Fantasy, and this one is a collection of stories about my generation, Gen Y. So check that out, and I'll see you guys next time.